On the morning of November 12, 1770, a group of 30 men stood at the edge of a dense forest in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. They had arrived the previous evening, traveling for 2 weeks on foot and by pack mule from the settlements near Philadelphia. Their leader was a 53-year-old farmer named John Height. He had purchased a tract of 200 acres from the Colonial Land Office, sight unseen, for the sum of 50 pounds sterling. The land was a slope of hardwoods and limestone, bisected by a creek that had no name on any map. The men carried axes, adzes, augers, crosscut saws, and a single broadaxe. They had no nails, no milled lumber, no glass, no iron hinges. They had no surveyor, no architect, no contractor. They had only the trees standing in front of them and the tools in their hands. By nightfall, they had felled 18 oak trees, each measuring between 30 and 40 feet in length. The work was brutal and exacting. The men worked in pairs, swinging their axes in rhythm, stripping branches, and notching trunks every 4 feet. They did not build a cabin that first day. Instead, they built a foundation of crosswise logs, raised 3 feet off the ground, and covered it with a tarp of oiled canvas. This would serve as a temporary shelter while the main structure was being raised. The temperature dropped to just above freezing that night. The men slept in their clothes, huddled around a fire of green wood that smoked more than it burned. The log cabin was not an American invention. It was a technique brought over by Swedish and German settlers in the late 17th century, and it spread across the frontier because it required only one thing: abundant timber. The method was deceptively simple. Trees were felled, trimmed, and cut to length. The ends were notched so that they locked together at the corners. The logs were stacked horizontally, one on top of another, and the gaps were filled with a mixture of clay and straw called chinking. The roof was made of split shingles held in place by weight and gravity. The door was a single slab of oak hung on leather hinges. The window was a hole covered with oiled paper. Inside there was one room, one fireplace, one bed frame made of saplings and rope. What happened in the weeks that followed was a sequence of decisions, each one dictated by necessity and the materials at hand. On the second day, the men dug a fire pit in the center of the temporary shelter and built a smoke hole in the roof. On the third day, they began splitting logs into floor planks using wedges and mallets. On the fourth day, they made a mistake. A tree they had felled rolled downhill and snapped the handle of their broadaxe. The handle was replaced with a piece of ash cut from the same forest, but the blade had to be reshaped with a file and whetstone, a process that cost them half a day. Delays like this were not exceptions. They were the norm. How could they have built a home from nothing? The answer lies not in the cabin itself, but in the network of knowledge that each man carried in his head. These were not wealthy landowners. They were tenant farmers, indentured servants, and recent immigrants who had traded years of labor for passage across the Atlantic. They had no formal training in construction. What they had was a deep familiarity with the properties of wood. They knew that oak was heavy and durable, that white pine split cleanly, that chestnut resisted rot, and that hickory was flexible enough to bend into barrel hoops or ox yokes. They knew to cut timber in the winter when the sap was low and the wood was dry. They knew that a notch cut at the wrong angle would cause the wall to lean. They knew that a foundation of flat stones would prevent the bottom logs from rotting in the damp soil. The cabin rose slowly over the first 2 weeks. Each log had to be lifted into place by ropes and muscle power, sometimes by a crew of 8 men on each side. The notches had to be cut with a level of precision that seems difficult to imagine without modern tools. The men did not use levels. They used their eyes. They sighted down the length of each log and adjusted the notch with a chisel until the surface was flat. When the walls reached a height of about 7 feet, they stopped. A full log cabin was typically 8 feet tall, but 7 feet was sufficient for a roof, and it saved time. The roof structure was a simple ridge pole supported by forked uprights at each end. The rafters were spaced about 2 feet apart, laid with split shingles cut from cedar logs. Each shingle was about 18 inches long and 4 inches wide, tapered at one end so that they could be overlapped like scales. By the end of the third week, the cabin was enclosed. There was no floor yet, only packed earth. There was no chimney, only a hole in the roof over the fireplace. The fireplace itself was a stone structure built against one wall, with a hearth of flat limestone and a smoke shelf of clay. Cooking was done in a single cast iron pot hung from a chain. The men slept on the floor, wrapped in blankets made of wool and linen. They ate boiled corn mush, salt pork, and dried beans, and they drank water from the creek that they boiled in the same pot. What investigators found when they examined remnants of similar cabins across the Appalachians was a pattern of resourcefulness that bordered on obsession. At a site in eastern Tennessee, archaeologists excavated a cabin floor from 1792 and found that the settlers had reused every scrap of iron, even bending old nails into hooks for hanging tools. At another site in Ohio, the floorboards were made from the wood of a wagon that had broken beyond repair. The settlers had salvaged the axles and used them as door hinges. They had burned the broken spokes for charcoal. Nothing was wasted. Not the bones from their meals, which were ground into fertilizer. Not the ashes from their fires, which were leached to make soap. Not the bark from the trees, which was boiled to produce a crude dye for clothing. The third week also brought the first real test of the cabin's integrity. A storm moved through the valley on the night of the 22nd day. The wind was strong enough to snap saplings. The cabin's roof held, but the chinking between the logs began to loosen. Clay crumbled and fell. Water seeped through the gaps. The men spent the next day mixing fresh chinking, using clay from the creek bank mixed with straw from the field they had started to clear. The mixture had to be thick enough to stay in place but wet enough to spread. They packed it into the gaps with their bare hands. It was a temporary solution. Over the winter, the cabin would require constant maintenance. The chinking would crack. The roof would leak. The door would warp. But that was the reality of life in a log cabin. It was not a finished product. It was a living structure constantly being repaired and modified as the seasons changed. Who were these people? The men who built John Hight's cabin were not all farmers. Among them was a shoemaker, a blacksmith, a weaver, and a man who had been a sailor before he came inland. They had no shared language at first. Some spoke German, some spoke English, and one spoke a dialect of Dutch that no one else understood. They communicated through gestures, repeated commands, and the physical language of shared labor. By the time the cabin was finished, they had developed a kind of pidgin speech, half German, half English, with words borrowed from Native American names for local plants and animals. Why does this story still matter? Because the log cabin was not just a building. It was a system of survival. It required no capital, no credit, no complex supply chains. It required only land, trees, and the willingness to work from sunup until sundown. In a period when millions of people were moving westward with nothing but a horse and a sack of seed corn, the log cabin was the most reliable tool they had. It could be built in 3 weeks or 3 months, depending on the size and the number of hands. It could be abandoned and rebuilt on another plot of land with the same trees. It was, in the truest sense, a home from nothing. But the process was not romantic. It was exhausting and dangerous. A falling tree could crush a man. A misstruck axe could split a foot. The smoke from the fire could cause lung infections that lasted a lifetime. Frostbite, dysentery, and snakebite were ordinary risks. The men who built these cabins did not think of themselves as pioneers or heroes. They thought of themselves as people who had no other choice. The frontier was not an open road. It was a wall of forest that had to be taken down one tree at a time. By the 4th week, the cabin was habitable, but not yet a home. The men had cleared about 2 acres of land for planting. They had built a root cellar dug into the hillside. They had erected a crude fence of split rails to keep out deer and stray cattle. They had cut enough firewood to last through the first freeze. Then, on the 30th day, Hight's wife and 3 children arrived with a cart pulled by a single ox. They brought bedding, cooking utensils, and a small bag of wheat seed. The cabin now had a floor of split logs, a shelf for the salt and meal, and a cradle for the baby. The family that would inhabit this place for the next 14 years had finally come. From the outside, the cabin looked like a stack of timber rising from a clearing in the forest. There was no paint, no glass in the window, no chimney taller than the roof ridge. Inside, the walls were blackened with soot. The floor was uneven. The room smelled of wood smoke, clay, and damp wool. But the family was dry, they were warm, and they were under a roof that they had built themselves. In the long arc of American history, this moment was repeated tens of thousands of times, from Maine to Oregon, from the Chesapeake to the Gulf. What investigators and historians have pieced together from diaries, tax records, and surviving structures is a clear picture of the system that made it possible. The log cabin was not a failure of architecture. It was a triumph of adaptive reuse. It took a raw material that was abundant, free, and renewable, and it turned it into shelter in a matter of weeks. The tools were simple. The knowledge was oral. The output was a home that could last a generation. On the morning of December 12, 1770, exactly 1 month after they had arrived, the men dismantled the temporary shelter they had built on the first night. They burned the tarp and the poles. The only remaining structure on the land was the cabin. The men packed their tools and walked away, heading back east to their own homesteads or to the next clearing that needed a cabin. John Haidt and his family stayed behind. There was no ceremony, no celebration, no newspaper article. The cabin was simply there, standing in the rain, holding the heat of the fire inside its heavy walls. This is the story of how settlers built a home from nothing. It starts in November of 1770 on a hillside in Virginia, with 30 men and 18 felled oak trees. But it does not end there. The process, the people, and the quiet resilience that made that first winter survivable are part of a much larger history, one that stretches across centuries and continents, and it begins to answer a fundamental question. How do you create permanence out of wilderness, with only your hands and the forest around you? But the story of the log cabin does not end with that first winter. In fact, the very techniques that made John Haidt's cabin possible had a much older and more complex origin. The log cabin, as it appeared in the American backcountry, was not a native invention. It was brought across the Atlantic by Swedish settlers in the early 17th century. When they arrived in what is now Delaware in 1638, they built using the same methods they had used in the forests of Scandinavia. Horizontal logs notched at the corners, stacked to form walls, with gaps filled with clay and moss. The English settlers who dominated the eastern seaboard had no such tradition. They built with timber frames and clapboards, using heavy oak beams joined by mortise and tenon. That method required skilled carpenters, iron nails, and specialized tools. The log cabin, by contrast, required only an axe, a saw, and a strong back. It was a technology of scarcity, designed for people who had no access to sawmills, blacksmiths, or lumber yards. For the first 60 years after the Swedish arrival, the log cabin remained a regional curiosity, confined to the lower Delaware River Valley. Then, in the decades between 1700 and 1740, German immigrants began arriving in large numbers. They came from the Palatinate, from Switzerland, from the Alsace region, from the war-torn principalities of Central Europe. They brought with them a similar timber-building tradition, but with important differences. German log construction used a different notch style. The Swedes used a saddle notch, where the log was cut to fit over the log below in a V-shaped seat. The Germans used a V-notch, where both logs were cut at 45-degree angles, creating a tighter corner joint. The German method was more difficult to cut, but produced a stronger wall. By the time John Haidt's cabin was built in 1770, the log cabin had spread from the Pennsylvania frontier down the Great Wagon Road through the Shenandoah Valley and into the Piedmont of North Carolina and Georgia. It became the default shelter for anyone who could not afford to buy land with an existing house. It was the architecture of the landless, the indentured, the refugee, the squatter, and the speculator. What happened when a family arrived at a claim in the middle of the forest with no shelter at all? On the 20th of May, 1775, a man named Jacob Weaver arrived at a parcel of land in what is now Fayette County, Pennsylvania. He had a wife, 3 children under the age of 10, a horse, a cow, 2 axes, a gun, a bag of cornmeal, and a sack of salt. He had no wagon, no plow, no iron pot, and no other tools. The nearest settlement was a day-and-a-half walk away. The trees around him were white oak, hickory, and chestnut, some of them 3 feet in diameter. He had to build a cabin before the next rain because his family was sleeping under a canvas tarp stretched over a ridgepole. He had to do it alone, with only a 9-year-old son to help. Weaver started by cutting down 8 young trees, each about 10 inches in diameter. He used the axe to trim the branches and bark, then cut them into logs 14 feet long. He laid 2 of them parallel on the ground, then notched the ends of the remaining logs and stacked them, one by one. He did not have a helper to lift the upper logs into place. He built a ramp of smaller logs, rolling each new log up the ramp and into the notch. By the end of the first day, the walls were 4 logs high. By the end of the second day, the walls were 8 logs high. On the third day, he cut the rafters and covered the roof with slabs of bark peeled from dead chestnut trees. He used no nails. He held the rafters in place by their own weight and by the pressure of the bark slabs overlapping. On the fourth day, a storm arrived. Weaver had no time to build a chimney. He cut a hole in the roof and built a fire in the middle of the dirt floor. The smoke filled the cabin. It stung the eyes of his wife and children. They coughed through the night. The canvas tarp had been better for smoke, but worse for rain. In the morning, Weaver built a small rock fireplace against one wall with a flue of clay and sticks leading to the roof hole. The fireplace was so inefficient that most of the heat went straight up the flue, but it was better than nothing. By the end of the first week, the cabin was habitable. The floor was still dirt. The door was a blanket hung over an opening. There was no window. The space measured about 12 feet by 14 feet. In that space, 5 people lived, 8 slept, gave birth, and died over the next 3 years. The cabin was not recorded in any official document. No diary survived. The only reason we know about Jacob Weaver is a property deed from 1785 that mentions a log dwelling house on the parcel and a note in the corner of a survey map. Weaver's cabin, burnt once of Savannah. The cabin was destroyed during a raid. Weaver and his family survived by hiding in the forest. They rebuilt a second cabin in the same spot in 1780. How could a family live like this? What made it possible for people to endure such conditions for years, sometimes decades? The answer lies in the social structure of the frontier. No family built alone. When a new settler arrived, the neighbors, if there were any, came to help with the raising. A cabin raising was a communal event. The men felled the trees, hauled the logs, and lifted the walls into place. The women cooked, carried water, and sewed the first set of bedding. The children gathered firewood and spread moss between the logs. In exchange, the new settler provided food and drink, usually whiskey, corn bread, and boiled meat. The work was done in one day if enough hands were present. A cabin built by a community was stronger and tighter than one built by a single man. On the 12th of September, 1787, a cabin raising took place in Washington County, Virginia. The land belonged to a widow named Margaret Brown, whose husband had died of a fever 3 months earlier. She had 4 children, 2 cows, and a pig. Her nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. The neighbor, a man named Samuel Craig, sent word to the surrounding settlement. 11 men showed up on the morning of the event. They cut down 40 logs, notched them, raised the walls, and covered the roof with split shingles by sunset. The fire was lit by dusk. The cabin had a door, a window shutter, a chimney, and a puncheon floor made of split logs laid flat side up. Margaret Brown and her children moved in that night. The cabin stood for 43 years, until a fire destroyed it in 1830. What investigators found when they studied the remains of that cabin was a pattern of wear that told a story of constant use. The floorboards near the fireplace were worn inches deep by the repeated motion of feet and the scraping of chairs. The door frame had been reinforced twice, once with iron straps and once with an extra oak plank. The chimney had been rebuilt at least 3 times, with different stone types indicating different periods. The cabin had not been a temporary shelter that was soon replaced. It had been a permanent home, occupied by 3 generations of the same family. but not every cabin survived. Many were abandoned within a few years, either because the land was exhausted, the family moved further west, or the structure collapsed under the weight of snow or rot. The typical lifespan of a log cabin in the Ohio Valley was about 15 years, unless it was continuously maintained. The logs at the base of the wall rotted first, especially if they were in direct contact with damp soil. Settlers learned to place the bottom logs on a foundation of stone or split logs, but many did not have the time or the stone to do so. A cabin that was not raised on a foundation would start to sag within 3 years. The walls would lean outward. The roof would warp. The gaps between the logs would widen, letting in wind and insects. On the 15th of February, 1803, a family in Knox County, Tennessee, woke up to find that their cabin wall had collapsed during the night. The logs had rotted at the base, and the wall had fallen outward, taking part of the roof with it. The family had to move out and build a new cabin in the spring. They salvaged the sound logs from the debris and used them for the new structure. The cabin that replaced it stood for 38 years, until the family sold the land and the new owner tore it down for firewood. The system of log cabin construction was not static. It evolved as settlers moved into different climates and encountered different tree species. In the pine forests of the Gulf Coast, cabins were built with lighter logs that could be split in half to create a flat interior surface. In the cedar groves of Kentucky, cabins were built with logs that naturally resisted rot and insect damage. In the treeless prairies of Illinois, settlers had to build with sod or with logs that were hauled from miles away. But the basic principle remained the same: a box made of trees, held together by the weight of the logs and the friction of the notches. No nails were needed, no hinges, no glass, no sawed lumber. The cabin could be built with an axe, a hand auger, and a draw knife. The auger was used to drill holes for wooden pegs that held the rafters and the door frame. The draw knife was used to shape the shingles and the door planks. The axe was used for everything else. What happened when a settler had no axe? On the 27th of October, 1799, a man named Isaac Bledsoe arrived at a claim in the Cumberland Gap region with only a tomahawk and a knife. He had lost his axe when his canoe capsized crossing a river. He built a cabin anyway. He felled trees by burning through the base of the trunk with a small fire, then chopping through the charred wood with the tomahawk. The process was slow. Each tree took an entire day to fell. He used the same fire technique to split the logs for the roof. The cabin took 6 months to build, and it was crude, but it kept his family dry for 2 years until he could buy a new axe. The cabin that Bledsoe built became part of a larger pattern. By 1810, the log cabin had spread from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. It was being built by settlers of every nationality, every religion, every economic level. The same basic design appeared from the Adirondacks to the Ozarks. The differences were only in the details: the size of the logs, the type of notch, the presence or absence of a loft, the height of the roof. Why did the log cabin become so standardized? Because it was the most efficient solution to a common problem. The problem was how to create a warm, dry, secure shelter using only the materials at hand, in the shortest possible time, with the least possible skill. The log cabin solved that problem so well that it remained the dominant form of rural housing in America until the mid-19th century, when balloon frame construction with machine-cut nails made it possible to build a house in a week without any heavy timbers. But the log cabin's legacy is not only architectural, it is also psychological. The cabin became a symbol of self-reliance, of the ability to start from zero and build something that could withstand a winter. It was used in presidential campaigns, most famously by William Henry Harrison in 1840, who was portrayed as the log cabin candidate, even though he was born on a plantation. The image stuck because it resonated with a population that had either lived in a log cabin or knew someone who had. What investigators have found in the historical record is that the log cabin was not always the idyllic home that later generations romanticized. Diaries from the period describe the cabin as dark, smoky, cramped, and infested with vermin. One woman wrote in her journal in 1813, "I have not seen a clean floor in 3 months. The children have lice. The bread is full of weevils. The roof leaks onto the bed. I cannot see out of the one window because the old paper is so yellow. I have no one to talk to except the cow." Another diary entry from 1806 in eastern Kentucky describes a family of 8 living in a cabin that measured 10 feet by 12 feet, with no separate room for cooking or sleeping. The parents and the youngest child slept on the floor near the fireplace. The older children slept in the loft, a space that was barely 4 feet high at the ridge, with a ladder made of 2 sticks. How could they endure such conditions? The answer is that they had no alternative. The cabin was not a choice. It was the only option available to people who had no money, no credit, and no access to the market economy. The land they were clearing was not a farm yet. It was a forest that had to be turned into a farm by the labor of their own bodies. The cabin was the base from which that transformation was made. Every hour spent clearing trees was an hour spent building the future farm. Every log cut for the cabin was a log that did not need to be burned or hauled away. The cabin was not a home in the modern sense. It was a tool. On the 3rd of March, 1811, a settler named William Hargrave recorded in his journal the exact dimensions of the cabin he was building in western New York. The logs were 12 feet long, 8 inches thick, and stacked 10 logs high. The roof was a single slope, made of split oak shingles. The chimney was built of fieldstone and clay. The door was made of 3 vertical planks held together by a crossbar and wooden pins. The window was a hole cut into the wall, covered with a wooden shutter that could be propped open in good weather. He finished the cabin in 19 days with the help of 2 neighbors. He planted corn on the cleared land that same spring. By autumn, he had enough corn to feed his family through the winter. The cabin was replaced by a frame house in 1815. The log cabin was dismantled and the logs were used as fence rails. What remains of these cabins today? Very little. Most were burned, collapsed, or torn down. The few that survive have been preserved in museums or as historic landmarks, but the ground beneath them often contains clues. Archaeologists have excavated cabin sites and found fragments of pottery, iron tools, bone fragments, and the remains of the hearth. At a site in Indiana, a cabin that was occupied from 1820 to 1845 yielded a layer of ash and charcoal that contained the seeds of corn, beans, and squash. The seeds were carbonized, preserved by the heat of the fire. They told a story of a diet that was monotonous but sufficient. At another site in Missouri, the excavation of a cabin from 1832 revealed a small cache of coins, hidden under a stone in the floor. The coins were dated 1828 to 1834. They were worth a total of 31 cents. The settler who hid them had probably died before returning to retrieve them. The coins were the only money that family had owned in at least 4 years. What happened to the people who lived in these cabins? Some stayed on the land, cleared more acres, built a larger house, and became prosperous farmers. Others sold out and moved further west, repeating the same process on a new claim. Many died young, killed by disease, accident, childbirth, or violence. The frontier was not a romantic landscape. It was a grinding, dangerous, and lonely place. The cabin was both the symbol of that hardship and the means of survival. Why does this story still matter? Because the log cabin represents a kind of problem solving that is almost lost in the modern world. It is the art of making something from nothing, using only what nature provides and what your hands can do. It is a reminder that civilization is not a given. It has to be built, one log at a time in the rain, with the smoke stinging your eyes and with no guarantee that you will live to see the harvest. On the 26th of November, 1770, John Hight's cabin was finished. The family moved in. The men who had helped build it left. The fire was lit. The logs began to dry and settle. The cabin would stand for 7 years, until a fire of unknown origin destroyed it in 1777. Height built a second cabin on the same spot, larger this time, with a stone chimney and a glass window. That cabin stood until 1810, when it was replaced by a brick house. The brick house still stands today, a museum with a plaque that mentions the original log cabin. But the cabin itself is gone. The logs rotted, the clay washed away. The stone hearth was buried under 3 feet of soil. All that remains is the memory, recorded in the deed and in the story that has been passed down. It is a story of 30 men, 18 trees, and a plot of land that no one wanted until someone decided to build a home from nothing. This is the history of the Log Cabin Years. It is not a story of heroes. It is a story of work, done day after day, in the cold and the smoke and the mud, by people who had no other choice. And it is a story that continues every time a family picks up an axe and starts to build not a home, but a future. On the 15th of October, 1784, a family by the name of Collier arrived at a plot of land in the Ohio country, near the confluence of the Muskingum River. They had walked for 3 weeks from Pennsylvania. Their belongings fit into a single cart pulled by 1 ox. The father, James Collier, was 32 years old. His wife, Mary, was 29. They had 4 children, ages 2 through 9. They owned no livestock except the ox. They had no cash. They had no tools except an axe, an auger, a drawknife, a handsaw, and a single iron wedge. The land was covered in oak, hickory, and maple. There was no shelter. There was no cleared ground. There was no road within 10 miles. Everything they needed to survive the coming winter had to be produced from the forest around them, with only their hands and those 5 tools. What happened next was not unusual. It was the standard procedure repeated by tens of thousands of families across the frontier. Collier selected a spot near a spring. He marked out a rectangle approximately 14 feet by 16 feet. He began felling trees. He did not select the straightest trees first. He selected the trees that were easy to split, which meant oak or hickory with minimal knots. He worked from dawn to dusk. His wife and children gathered firewood, cleared brush, and carried water. On the 3rd day, a neighbor who had arrived the previous year walked 8 miles to help. His name was Thomas Ward. He brought a froe and a mallet for splitting shingles. By the 7th day, the logs for the walls were cut, dragged into place, and notched. Collier used the saddle notch, a simple V-shaped cut that locked the log into the one below it. The gaps between logs were filled with split pieces of wood, called chinking, which were then daubed with a mixture of mud and dried grass. The roof was made of split oak shingles laid over a ridge pole. The chimney was built of sticks and mud, set against the outside of the gable end. By the 14th day, the cabin was complete enough to move into. There was a single door opening, covered by a blanket because there was no time to make a proper door. There was no window. The floor was packed earth. On the 1st of November, 1784, the Collier family slept inside their cabin for the first time. The temperature that night dropped to freezing. Inside, the fire kept the cabin warm enough that the children did not need blankets, but the smoke filled the room because the chimney did not draw properly. They coughed all night. In the morning, the youngest child had burns on her arm from rolling into the hearth during the night. Mary treated the burns with a poultice of crushed plantain leaves and spiderweb, a frontier remedy that worked better than anything a doctor could provide at that time. The cabin that Collier built was not an improvement over his previous home. In Pennsylvania, he had lived in a stone house with 2 rooms, a glass window, and a cast iron stove. That was now gone. He had sold it to finance the move west. The cabin was a step backward in every measurable way, but the land was his. He owed no rent. He paid no taxes for the first 5 years. He could hunt and fish without permission. For Collier, that trade-off was acceptable. For his wife, the diary she kept for 2 years before giving up suggests the trade-off was harder to bear. She wrote, "I have not seen another woman since we left. I speak to the children and the cow. James speaks of next year and the year after. I look at the trees and see only a prison." What investigators of the historical record find is that the cabin was not the end of the building process. It was the beginning. In the spring of 1785, Collier cleared 3 acres of farmland by girdling the trees. He planted corn, beans, and squash between the dead trunks. He built a fence of split rails to keep deer out. By summer, he had a small crop. By autumn, he had enough corn to make meal for the winter. In the winter of 1785, he built a barn, smaller than the cabin but built with the same log technique. In 1786, he built a smokehouse. In 1787, he built a second cabin for his parents, who followed him west. The cabin itself was abandoned in 1792 when Collier finished a frame house, built with sawn lumber and a stone foundation. The cabin was used as a shed for storing tools. In 1798, it collapsed under a heavy snow. The logs were salvaged and burned as firewood. The chimney stones were pulled out and used for a well lining. By 1805, there was no trace of the cabin above ground. The site was plowed under. Corn grew over the place where the fire had burned for 8 winters. How many cabins followed this exact arc? No precise count exists, but the pattern was so common that frontier historians estimate that at least 90% of log cabins built between 1750 and 1850 were destroyed or dismantled within 30 years of construction. They were never intended to be permanent. They were temporary shelters, built to be replaced as soon as the settler could afford better materials. The romantic image of the ancestral log cabin, passed down through generations, is almost entirely a myth. Most settlers wanted to get out of the log cabin as quickly as possible. On the 12th of August, 1803, a surveyor named John Tipton recorded a log cabin in the Indiana Territory that was being built by a man named Samuel Wells. Wells was a former military officer who had been granted land for his service in the Revolutionary War. He was literate, wealthy by frontier standards, and had access to hired labor. His cabin was 20 feet by 24 feet with a loft, a stone chimney, and a window with real glass. He built it in 8 days with a crew of 12 men, but Wells did not live in it. He used it as a hunting lodge. He continued to live in a frame house he had built the previous year in a nearby town. What this reveals is that the log cabin was not a marker of poverty. It was a marker of priority. A man with resources could build a log cabin faster and cheaper than a frame house, so he built the log cabin first, then built the frame house at his leisure. A man without resources built the log cabin because it was the only thing he could build. In both cases, the log cabin served the same function. It provided shelter while the larger project of building a farm, a community, or a life was underway. The difference was in the interior. Wells' cabin had a floor of sawn planks. The walls were chinked with lime mortar which stayed harder than clay and kept out rodents. The chimney was built of brick, fired in a kiln that Wells had built the previous year. He had a cast iron cook stove, a chair, a table, and a bed frame. The Collier cabin had none of these. The floor was dirt. The walls were chinked with mud that cracked and fell out after every rain. The chimney was a fire hazard. The furniture was a stump and a plank. The bed was a pile of leaves covered with a blanket. The two cabins served the same function, but they were not the same experience. What historians have found is that the material quality of a log cabin is one of the most reliable indicators of a family's economic trajectory. A well-built cabin with a stone chimney, a good roof, and a plank floor was often the first step toward a prosperous farm. A poorly built cabin with a stick chimney, a leaky roof, and a dirt floor was often the last step before abandonment. The cabin did not determine the outcome, but it was a signal of the resources and skills that the family brought to the frontier. At a site in western Virginia, excavated in 1968, archaeologists found the remains of a cabin that had been built in 1775 and occupied for only 3 years. The cabin was small, 12 feet by 14 feet. The hearth was a shallow pit lined with fieldstone. The floor was compacted clay, but it had been covered with a layer of ash which may have been used as a form of pest control. The only artifacts found were a broken iron pot, a single clay pipe bowl, and a handful of buttons. No coins, no tools, no evidence of any decorative object. The family that lived there had only the barest minimum of material culture. They were not poor because they failed. They were poor because they were at the very edge of the frontier, where everything had to be carried on foot, and there was no room for anything that did not serve a direct survival purpose. What happened to that family? The record shows that the head of household, a man named Jacob Moore, was killed in a hunting accident in Once-a-Vincevene. His wife and children disappeared from the record. They may have moved back east to live with relatives. They may have died in the harsh winter of Once-a-Vincevene. The cabin was looted and then burned, possibly by Native American raiders, possibly by another settler looking for scrap materials. The site was not reoccupied for 40 years. Why does this matter? Because the log cabin years were not a single story of progress. They were thousands of individual stories, most of which ended in failure. The families that succeeded were the ones who had a combination of health, luck, skill, and community support. The families that failed were not lazy or incompetent. They were simply unlucky. A bad winter, a crop failure, an injury, a disease outbreak, a hostile encounter, a fire. Any one of these could destroy everything a family had built in a single season. The cabin was built to be replaced, but many families never got the chance. On the 9th of May, 1813, a cabin in the Missouri Territory was struck by lightning. The roof caught fire. The family inside escaped, but the cabin was completely destroyed. They had no insurance, no savings, no nearby relatives. They spent the summer sleeping under a wagon. By autumn, they had rebuilt, but the effort consumed the entire year's labor. They fell behind on their crop planting. The next winter, they nearly starved. They sold the land in 1815 and moved to Illinois, where they started again. The cabin they built in Illinois was identical to the one that had burned. It stood for 10 years, then was dismantled. The family eventually bought a frame house in 1819. The father died in 1837 at the age of 64. The mother died in 1840. They never spoke of the lightning strike again, according to their granddaughter who recorded the story in a letter in 1880. That letter is one of the few direct accounts of an emotional response to the loss of a log cabin. Most settlers did not write about their feelings. They wrote about weather, crops, and prices. The cabin was not a symbol to them. It was a structure. But in the granddaughter's letter, there is a nuance. She wrote, "Grandmother said that when the cabin burned, she felt a strange relief. She had hated that cabin. It was dark and cold, and it had a smell that never washed out of her clothes. But when it was gone, she had nowhere to sleep. She did not know which was worse, the cabin or the wagon. In the end, the cabin was rebuilt exactly as it had been, because that was the only thing they knew how to build." This is the reality of the log cabin years. The cabin was not a home in the emotional sense. It was a machine for surviving the night. It was a box made of trees, sealed with mud, heated by fire, and filled with smoke. It was not comfortable, not safe, not clean, and not healthy, but it was enough, and enough was all that the frontier required. The next generation would build a better house, on the same land, out of the same trees, but with different tools, different skills, and different expectations. That is the cycle. That is the history. That is what the log cabin represents. Not a golden age, but a grinding, patient, relentless process of making a place in the world, one log at a time. On the 22nd of October, 1817, a family named the Bakers arrived at a plot of land in the Ohio country, near what is now the town of Marietta. They had traveled for 6 weeks from Pennsylvania, a distance of roughly 300 miles by wagon and on foot. The father, Thomas Baker, was 38 years old. The mother, Elizabeth Baker, was 34. They had 4 children, ages 9, 7, 5, and 2. They carried with them a single axe, a handsaw, a hammer, a bag of nails, a cooking pot, a sack of cornmeal, and a change of clothes for each person. They owned no livestock. They had no seed grain. They arrived in late autumn when the leaves had already fallen and the ground was beginning to freeze. Thomas Baker had chosen this land based on a survey map he had seen in a land office in Philadelphia. He had never visited it before. The map showed a river, a stream, and a stand of hardwood timber. What the map did not show was that the river flooded in the spring, that the stream was brackish, and that the hardwood timber was mostly elm and poplar, which rotted quickly when used as logs. Within 2 days of arrival, Thomas Baker realized the land was poor, but he had no money to move again. He had used his entire savings to purchase the claim. He began cutting trees on the morning of the 23rd. By noon, he had felled 6 white oaks which he had found in a small grove near the river. These were the only trees on the property suitable for a cabin. He used the handsaw to cut them into 14-foot lengths, then dragged them into a rough square with the help of his wife. The children gathered branches and leaves for the roof. By nightfall on the 24th, the walls were up to 4 feet. The family slept that night under the wagon, wrapped in blankets with a small fire burning nearby. On the 25th, a neighbor named Elijah Croft, who lived 3 miles away, arrived with his 2 teenage sons. They had heard the sound of the axe and came to help. In the frontier, this was an unspoken obligation. A new family could not survive alone, and a man who refused to help a neighbor would find no help when he needed it. Elijah Croft brought an extra axe and a broadaxe for shaping the logs. By evening on the 26th, the cabin was complete. The walls were 8 logs high. The roof was covered with split shingles made from poplar. The door was a blanket hung from a peg. The chimney was made of mud and sticks, built against one wall. The floor was the bare ground. The family moved in on the 27th of October. The cabin was 12 feet by 14 feet, the same size as the one occupied by Jacob Moore in Virginia 42 years earlier. It had 1 room. The children slept on a platform of branches and leaves in the loft, reached by climbing a notched log. The parents slept on the ground near the fire. There was no window. The smoke from the fire escaped through a hole in the roof, but only about half of it made it out. The rest hung in the room, coating the walls and the family's lungs with a thin layer of soot. On the 10th of November, the 2-year-old child, a boy named Samuel, developed a cough. By the 15th, the cough had become a fever. Elizabeth Baker tried to treat him with a tea made from the bark of a black walnut tree, a remedy she had learned from her mother. It did nothing. On the 19th, Samuel stopped eating. On the 21st, he died. The death of a child on the frontier was common. In 1817, infant mortality rates in the Ohio country were estimated at 35%. But the rate inside a log cabin, with no access to a doctor and no ability to keep the child warm and dry, was higher. The cabin had a leak in the roof that dripped onto the loft platform. The clay chinking in the walls had cracked in the first hard freeze. The cabin was drafty. The fire was insufficient to keep the temperature above freezing at night. Samuel died of pneumonia, compounded by exposure. The family buried the child on the morning of the 22nd. They had no coffin. They wrapped the body in a blanket and lowered it into a shallow grave dug in the frozen ground with a shovel borrowed from Elijah Croft. Thomas Baker marked the grave with a cross made from 2 split poplar logs. The cross stood for 3 years before it rotted and fell. What happened after that was typical. The family survived the winter barely. The cornmeal ran out in January. They ate boiled acorns and roots. In February, Thomas Baker shot a deer, but the meat spoiled before it could be fully preserved. They had no salt. They smoked what they could, but the cabin had no smokehouse. The fire was the only source of preservation. By March, the family was starving. Elijah Croft brought a sack of flour and a piece of salted pork. He had enough for his own family and shared what he could. In the spring, the river flooded. The cabin sat on low ground and the water rose to within 6 inches of the doorstep. The floor became mud. The family moved everything into the loft. The water did not recede for nearly 3 weeks. When it did, the cabin was permanently damp. The logs began to rot at the base. Thomas Baker had built the cabin on a foundation of flat stones, but the stones had sunk into the saturated soil. The cabin tilted slightly to the left. It would never be straight again. How could a family survive this? The answer is that many did not. Between 1817 and 1820, the Baker family survived, but at a cost. The 2 older children, ages 9 and 7, developed chronic respiratory problems. Elizabeth Baker suffered from recurring fevers, likely from contaminated water. Thomas Baker developed a persistent cough that he never fully recovered from. They continued to farm the land, but it was hard. The soil was thin and rocky. The crops failed in 1820 due to drought. In 1821, they sold the land for half of what they had paid and moved to Indiana, where Thomas Baker had heard the soil was deeper. They built another cabin in Indiana. It was almost identical to the first. This time, Thomas Baker chose the land more carefully. He spent a week walking the property before committing. He built the cabin on higher ground. He used white oak logs that he had cut and seasoned for 3 months. The floor was made of split puncheons, not dirt. The chimney was built of fieldstone, not mud and sticks. The cabin was 16 feet by 20 feet, slightly larger than the first. The family lived in it for 8 years. In 1829, Thomas Baker built a frame house, 2 stories tall, with glass windows and a porch. The log cabin was converted into a barn. It was torn down in 1845 when the barn needed to be expanded. The Baker family succeeded in the end, but the success was not guaranteed. It was the result of a series of decisions, some wise, some desperate, and some purely lucky. The first cabin nearly killed them. The second cabin gave them a foothold. The frame house was the prize, but the log cabin years were the most dangerous. In those years, the family was most vulnerable. A single bad winter, a single flood, a single illness, and the entire project could collapse. What investigators have found, through the study of census records, tax rolls, and family letters, is that the likelihood of a family succeeding on the frontier was strongly correlated with the quality of the first cabin they built. A cabin with a stone chimney, a plank floor, and a tight roof reduced the risk of fire, disease, and exposure. A cabin with a mud chimney, a dirt floor, and a leaky roof increased those risks. The difference was not just comfort, it was survival. The system that failed the Bakers in 1817 was not a single system. It was a network of systems that were all operating at the edge of capacity. The land survey system had misled Thomas Baker into buying poor land. The transportation system had taken 6 weeks to get him there, consuming supplies that could have been used for building. The medical system did not exist. The community support system was weak because the population was sparse. The weather system was unpredictable. The economic system did not allow for a margin of error. Every decision had to be made with incomplete information, and every mistake had consequences that could be fatal. Why does this still matter? Because the log cabin years are the foundation of the American settlement narrative, but the narrative has been romanticized. The real story is not one of heroic individualism. It is one of collective vulnerability. The settlers who succeeded were the ones who had help, who had luck, and who had the ability to learn from their mistakes. The settlers who failed were not lesser people. They were people who ran out of time, resources, or help. On the 15th of February, 1834, a man named John Patterson wrote a letter to his brother in New York. He had built a log cabin in 1830 in the Michigan Territory. The cabin was still standing. He was proud of it. But in the letter, he said something that captures the ambivalence of the experience. He wrote, "I have lived in this cabin for 4 years. My wife has borne 2 children here. One of them is dead. The cabin is warm enough, but it is never dry. The smoke burns my eyes. The floor is uneven. The roof leaks in 3 places. And yet I cannot bring myself to leave it. Every log in this wall I cut with my own hands. Every nail I drove myself. The cabin is mine in a way that nothing else has ever been mine. But I will tear it down as soon as I can afford to build a proper house. I will not miss it, but I will remember it." The Patterson cabin was torn down in 1883. The frame house that replaced it stood until 1923 when it burned down. The land was sold and subdivided. The original cabin site is now a parking lot. Nothing remains of the log cabin years except the stories, and even those are fading. But the process that the Patterson family and the Baker family experienced is the process that built the American frontier. It was not fast. It was not graceful. It was not romantic. It was a slow, grinding, repetitive cycle of cutting, building, failing, and rebuilding. The cabin was not the goal. The cabin was the price of admission. The goal was the farm, the town, the school, the church, the road, the railroad, the city. The log cabin was the first step, and for many, it was the hardest step of all. On the 24th of June, 1837, a woman named Sarah Thompson gave birth to her third child in a log cabin in the Illinois Territory. The cabin was 14 feet by 16 feet. It had a dirt floor. It had no windows. The only light came from the open door and the fire. The birth was attended by her husband, who had never delivered a child before, and a neighbor woman who had walked 2 miles through a rainstorm to help. The child was born healthy. The mother survived, but the conditions inside that cabin were not conducive to a safe birth. The dirt floor was damp. The fire produced smoke that hung in the room. The roof had a leak that dripped onto the bed. The neighbor woman later wrote in a letter that she had to hold an umbrella over the mother during the delivery to keep her dry. What happened that day was not unusual. Childbirth inside a log cabin was the norm across the American frontier for generations, but the conditions that made it possible are worth examining. The cabin was not designed for family life. It was designed for survival. The hearth was the center of everything. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook, but it also filled the cabin with smoke. The smoke helped preserve the logs and kept insects away, but it also damaged the lungs of everyone inside. Sarah Thompson's husband, James, later wrote in a diary that his eyes burned constantly for the first 2 years. He could not see clearly at night. He attributed it to the smoke, and he was correct. The role of women in the log cabin years is often overlooked in the romanticized version of the frontier, but women carried the heaviest burden. They cooked, cleaned, carried water, tended children, planted gardens, preserved food, and often assisted in building. They also gave birth repeatedly, with no medical care. The mortality rate for women in childbirth in log cabins was estimated at 1 in 10 in the 1A0s and 1A30s. For children, it was higher. The cabin itself was part of the problem. Cold, damp, and dark, infections spread easily. There was no way to isolate a sick family member. The cabin had one room. Everyone lived, ate, slept, and died in that same space. How could a family survive this? The answer is community. The Thompsons did not survive alone. The neighbor woman who helped with the birth was one of several families within a 5-mile radius. They formed an informal network of mutual aid. When James Thompson needed to raise a roof beam, 3 neighbors arrived. When a neighbor's cabin burned down in 1839, the Thompsons took the family in for 2 months. The log cabin years were not a story of individuals conquering the wilderness. They were a story of small, fragile groups of people holding each other up. In the same year that Sarah Thompson gave birth, a man named Henry Clay Whitney was building a cabin in the Wisconsin Territory. Whitney was 23 years old. He had no experience in construction. He had never swung an axe before leaving Massachusetts. He relied on a book called The Farmer's Instructor that described how to notch logs. The book's instructions were vague. Whitney's first attempt at a saddle notch produced a cabin that was so crooked that the roof beam did not reach the opposite wall. He had to dismantle the entire structure and start over. The second attempt took 5 weeks. The cabin was functional but unstable. It began to lean within a year. Whitney later wrote that the cabin seemed to have a mind of its own, and that mind was hostile. The learning curve for log cabin construction was steep. Many settlers had never held an axe. They learned by trial and error. The most common mistakes were improper notching, insufficient seasoning of the logs, and poor site selection. A cabin built on low ground would flood. A cabin built on a slope would shift. A cabin built with green logs would shrink and leave gaps that could not be sealed. The settlers who succeeded were the ones who had seen a cabin built before, who had a neighbor to guide them, or who had the patience to wait. The ones who failed often did so within the first year. The Thompson cabin stood for 9 years. In 1846, James Thompson built a frame house using lumber sawed at a mill that had opened 12 miles away. The log cabin became a storage shed. It was used to store firewood and apples. In 1852, it was demolished. The logs were burned in the hearth of the new house. Nothing remains of it today, but the site was recorded in a county history in 1878. The description notes that the cabin was built of round logs with a roof of split shakes and a chimney of mud and sticks. That description is the only record. By the 1840s, the log cabin was already becoming a symbol of something it was not. In the presidential election of 1840, William Henry Harrison's campaign used the log cabin as a symbol of humble origins. Harrison was born in a plantation house in Virginia, not a log cabin, but his campaign distributed log cabin imagery on flags, posters, and banners. The slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. The log cabin became shorthand for the common man. Voters responded. Harrison won. The log cabin that the campaign sold was not the cabin that settlers lived in. It was clean, spacious, and bright. It had glass windows and a stone chimney. It was a fantasy. What happened in the decades that followed is that the real log cabin faded from memory. The cabins were torn down. The families moved into frame houses. The stories of hardship, death, and failure were replaced by stories of resilience and triumph. The cabins that survived were preserved as relics, but they were not representative. A log cabin from 1830 that still stands in 1900 was usually the cabin of a wealthier family who had the resources to build well, the luck to survive, and the desire to keep it. The cabins that collapsed or burned were forgotten. On the 2nd of November, 1845, a farmer named Andrew Miller died in a log cabin in the Indiana Territory. He was 57 years old. He had lived in that cabin for 23 years. His sole surviving child wrote a letter to a cousin describing the death. The letter said, "Father died in the bed where he had slept for 2 decades. The cabin has no window near the bed. The only light came from a candle made of tallow. He asked me to open the door so he could see the sky. I did. He looked out at the field he had cleared with his own hands. He said nothing after that. He died at dusk." The letter goes on to describe the cabin's condition. The roof had been patched with bark. The floor was bare earth worn smooth by years of walking. The chimney had been rebuilt 3 times. The walls were black with soot. The cabin was not a home, it was a shelter. But it was the only home Miller had known for 23 years. He had arrived in 1822 with his wife and 4 children. 1 child died in the first winter. His wife died in 1836. 2 children moved away. The surviving child stayed. The cabin was the constant. The system that kept Andrew Miller in that cabin for 23 years was not a system of success. It was a system of survival. He had cleared 40 acres. He grew corn, wheat, and potatoes. He raised pigs. He traded surplus for salt, sugar, and tools. But he never had enough capital to build a frame house. The log cabin was not a choice. It was a trap. The cabin was cheap to build but expensive to maintain. The constant repairs consumed time that could have been used for other work. The cabin held the family back, but it also held them together. Why does this matter? Because the log cabin years are the foundation of the American settlement narrative, but the narrative has been romanticized. The real story is not one of heroic individualism. It is one of collective vulnerability, of people living on the edge of failure, held together by community, luck, and stubbornness. The settlers who succeeded were not stronger or smarter. They were the ones who had help, who had time, and who had the ability to adapt. The settlers who failed were not lesser people. They were people who ran out of time, resources, or help. The Thompson cabin, the Whitney cabin, the Miller cabin, all gone. The sites are now farmland, parking lots, or suburban lawns. The logs were burned, rotted, or hauled away. The memory persists only in county histories, family letters, and the rare surviving structure. But the process that those families experienced is the process that built the American frontier. It was not fast. It was not graceful. It was not romantic. It was a slow, grinding, repetitive cycle of cutting, building, failing, and rebuilding. The cabin was not the goal. The cabin was the price of admission. The goal was the farm, the town, the school, the church, the road, the railroad, the city. The log cabin was the first step, and for many, it was the hardest step of all. In the autumn of 1841, a surveyor named John Wesley Baldwin traveled through the Indiana Territory to document land claims for the federal government. He kept a journal. On the 6th of October, he arrived at the cabin of a family named Grove. The cabin was located on a creek near present-day Spencer County. Baldwin noted that the cabin was 13 feet by 16 feet. The logs were notched with a simple V-cut. The roof was made of split oak shingles held down by poles. The chimney was built of mud and stone and leaned noticeably to the left. Inside, the cabin contained one bed, one table, two stools, a spinning wheel, and a cast iron pot. The family had 7 children. Baldwin wrote that the children slept on the floor on a pile of leaves and blankets. He estimated the value of the cabin and its contents at $25. That was less than the price of a good horse. What happened to the Grove family? Baldwin's journal does not say. But the land records show that the family sold the claim in 1846 and moved west. They were part of a larger pattern. Settlers did not stay in log cabins permanently. The cabin was a temporary structure. The average log cabin stood for about 10 to 15 years before it was replaced or abandoned. A cabin built in 1830 might be empty by 1/8 Furfit. The timber rotted, the roof leaked, the chimney collapsed. The family either improved the structure or moved on. Most moved on. By the 1840s, the frontier had shifted westward. The land that had been wilderness in 1820 was now farmland. The trees were gone. The logs that built the cabins had been burned or sold. The cabins themselves became obstacles. A family that wanted to build a frame house first had to tear down the cabin. The logs were often reused. Some were sawn into lumber. Some were split into fence rails. Some were burned in the fireplace of the new house. The cabin was consumed by the progress it had made possible. But the cabin also left a mark on the land. The foundation stones remained. The chimney sometimes remained. The cellar hole, if there was one, filled with leaves and dirt over time. By the 1860s, a traveler could walk through a clearing in Ohio or Indiana and see the outline of the cabin floor, the dark rectangle of the cellar, the pile of stones that had once been a hearth. These sites were not marked. They were not remembered. They were simply places where someone had once tried to build a life. On the 3rd of March, 1843, a family named Hargrave arrived at a site in the Michigan Territory. They had traveled from Vermont. The father, Josiah Hargrave, was 42 years old. He had sold his farm in Vermont for $200. He bought a wagon, 2 oxen, and supplies. The journey took 6 weeks. When they arrived, the land was wooded. There was no shelter. Josiah built a lean-to of bark and branches for the first night. The next morning, he began cutting trees. The Hargrave cabin was typical of the early 1840s. It was 16 feet by 18 feet. The logs were white oak. The notches were saddle joints. The roof was covered with elm bark. The floor was dirt. The chimney was made of clay and stones gathered from the creek. The cabin took 3 weeks to build. Josiah's wife, Mary, helped cut the smaller logs and carried rocks for the chimney. Their oldest son, age 15, hewed the door frame. The youngest child, age 3, stayed in the lean-to. The cabin was finished on the 25th of March. That night, the family moved in. They had no furniture. They slept on the floor. The first meal cooked in the new fireplace was a pot of beans and salted pork. Mary Hargrave later wrote in a letter to her sister that she cried when she saw the smoke rising from the chimney. She was not crying from joy. She was crying because she understood that this was now her home, and that home was a dirt-floored room with no windows, no stove, and no future she could see. The Hargrave family stayed in that cabin for 5 years. In that time, Josiah cleared 18 acres. He built a barn. He dug a well. He planted an orchard. He raised 5 pigs and 2 cows. The cabin was improved. A puncheon floor was laid in 1/8 Furfit. A window was cut in 1/8 Furfit. A second room was added in 1/8 Furfit. But the cabin remained a log structure. It was never a comfortable home. It was a machine for survival. In 1848, Josiah Hargrave died of pneumonia. He had been working in the rain for 2 days to build a fence. He came home soaked, sat by the fire, and did not get up. He died 3 days later. Mary Hargrave was left with 5 children. She could not maintain the farm alone. She sold the land to a neighbor and moved to a town where her brother lived. The cabin was sold with the land. The new owner tore it down in 1850 and built a frame house. The logs were used for firewood. The chimney was knocked down and the stones were used for a foundation. Nothing of the Hargrave cabin survives. How could a family survive this? The question is difficult to answer because so many did not. The mortality rate for frontier settlers was high. One study of early Ohio settlers found that 40% of families who arrived between 1800 and 1820 had lost at least one child within the first 5 years. Another study of Indiana settlers showed that the average life expectancy for a settler born in 1800 was 35 years. The cabin was not a home. It was a survival shelter, but some families did more than survive. The story of the Logan family in the Illinois Territory offers a different example. Robert Logan arrived in 1829 with his wife and 3 children. He built a cabin on a rise overlooking a creek. The cabin was larger than average, 20 feet by 24 feet. The logs were squared with a broad axe. The notches were dovetailed. The roof was made of milled shingles that Logan had brought with him from Kentucky. The chimney was built of brick that he had fired himself. The cabin had 2 windows, each with glass panes that Logan had carried in a crate for 300 miles. The Logan cabin was comfortable by frontier standards. The floor was planked. The walls were chinked with clay and lime. The fireplace had a stone hearth. The furniture included a table, chairs, a bed frame, and a cupboard. The family had books. They had a Bible, a primer, and a volume of Shakespeare. Robert Logan was literate. He kept a diary. In that diary, he recorded the daily life of the cabin, the planting, the harvest, the births, the deaths, the neighbors who visited, the sermons that were preached in the cabin on Sundays. The Logan family succeeded where others failed. Why? The answer is not simply luck. Robert Logan had capital. He had arrived with money from the sale of his farm in Kentucky. He had tools, seeds, livestock, and supplies. He had knowledge. He had built a cabin before. He had a network. His brother had settled nearby. He had access to a mill within 10 miles. The cabin was not a leap into the unknown. It was a calculated move. But even the Logans had difficulties. In the winter of 1831, the creek froze. The mill could not grind grain. The family subsisted on cornmeal and salted pork for 4 months. In 1833, a fever swept through the area. Logan's youngest child died. The cabin became a sick room. The diary records the child's final days in spare, plain language. The child took to bed on Tuesday. She could not keep food down. By Thursday, she was weak. On Friday, she died in her mother's arms. We buried her on the hill behind the cabin. The cabin could not protect them. It could not provide warmth in a way that prevented disease. It could not offer isolation from infection. The cabin was a box. Everything that happened inside it was shared. The good and the bad were mixed together. The smell of cooking was also the smell of sickness. The sound of laughter was also the sound of grief. The cabin was the stage on which every act of frontier life was performed. What happened to the Logan cabin? Robert Logan lived in it for 14 years. In 1843, he built a 2-story frame house 100 yards away. The cabin was left standing. It was used as a storage room for tools and grain. In 1852, it was struck by lightning. The dry roof caught fire. The cabin burned to the ground. Logan did not rebuild it. He wrote in his diary, "The old cabin is gone. It was a good shelter in its time, but its time has passed." By the 1850s, the log cabin was becoming an anachronism. The frontier had moved to the Great Plains. The forests of the eastern frontier had been cleared. The settlers who moved into the prairies did not build log cabins. There were no trees. They built sod houses instead. The log cabin became a memory. But that memory was already being reshaped. In 1856, a book called The Log Cabin, A History was published. It was written by a man named Samuel Griswold Goodrich. Goodrich had grown up in a log cabin in Connecticut in the once-a-Zeros. His book was not a history. It was a nostalgic idealization. He described the log cabin as the birthplace of American liberty. He wrote about the warmth of the fireplace, the sweetness of the simple life, the strength of the family gathered around the hearth. He did not mention the smoke, the cold, the disease, or the death. Goodrich's book was popular. It sold thousands of copies. It was used in schools. It shaped the way Americans thought about the frontier. The real cabin was replaced by the idea of the cabin. The idea was clean, warm, and safe. The idea was a place where hard work was rewarded and where the family was protected. The idea was a lie, but the lie served a purpose. It gave Americans a story about their origins. It said that the nation was built by people who had nothing and made something. It said that the cabin was the cradle of democracy. It said that the frontier was not a place of suffering but a place of opportunity. The lie was comforting. It was also useful. It justified expansion. It sanctified hardship. It turned a brutal experience into a noble one. The truth is more complicated. The log cabin years were not a golden age. They were a period of transition. The settlers who lived in cabins were not heroes. They were people trying to survive. Some succeeded. Many failed. The ones who succeeded were often the ones who had help, who had resources, who had connections, who had luck. The ones who failed were often the ones who had none of those things. The log cabin itself was not a symbol of freedom. It was a symbol of limitation. It was the cheapest, fastest, most basic structure that could be built. It was not a home. It was a shelter. It was not a choice. It was a necessity. The people who lived in log cabins did not romanticize them. They wanted out. They wanted a frame house with windows, a stove, a floor, and a door that could be closed. They wanted a life that was not dominated by the constant struggle to keep the cabin from collapsing, the roof from leaking, the chimney from falling, and the family from freezing. The cabin was a stepping stone. It was not the destination. The destination was the farm, the town, the railroad, the factory, the school, the city. The cabin was the first step, and for many, it was the hardest step of all. On the 1st of January, 1863, a man named Elias Baker wrote a letter to his brother in Ohio. Baker had settled in Kansas in 1857. He had built a log cabin. By 1863, the cabin was still standing. Baker wrote about the cabin with a tone of resignation, not pride. He said, "The cabin is still here. It is still cold. It is still dark. The roof still leaks. The chimney still smokes. I have patched it so many times that it is more patched than cabin. I could build a new house, but I do not have the lumber, I do not have the money, I do not have the time, so I live in the cabin. It is not a home, it is a place to sleep." Baker died in that cabin in 1869. His son built a frame house the following year. The cabin was torn down. The logs were used to build a barn. The barn burned in 1885. The logs were lost. The site is now a cornfield. There is no marker. The log cabin years ended not with a celebration but with a quiet transition. The cabins were abandoned, burned, or torn down. The families moved into better houses. The children grew up and moved away. The cabins became a memory, then a story, then a legend. The legend survives. The cabin does not, but the cabin's legacy is real. The cabin shaped the lives of the families who lived in it. It shaped their bodies. It shaped their relationships. It shaped their expectations. It taught them that survival was possible. It taught them that comfort was not guaranteed. It taught them that community was essential. It taught them that the land could be mastered, but only at a cost. The cost was measured in lives. The children who died of fever, the women who died in childbirth, the men who died of exhaustion, the families who gave up and moved back east, the families who stayed and lost everything. The cost was high, but the families kept coming. They kept building. They kept cutting trees, notching logs, raising roofs, and lighting fires. They built the cabin. The cabin built them, and then it was gone. The cabin was replaced. The forest was cleared. The field was planted. The railroad came. The town grew. The highway was built. The subdivision was developed. The supermarket was opened. The past was paved over. But somewhere under the asphalt, under the concrete, under the grass, under the soil, there is a patch of ground where a cabin once stood. The foundation stones are buried. The cellar hole is filled. The chimney is rubble. The logs are dust, but the ground remembers. The ground holds the memory of the family who arrived with nothing, cut the trees, built the box, and called it home. The log cabin years are over, but they are not forgotten. They live in the bones of the country, in the land itself, in the stories that survive, in the letters that were saved, in the diaries that were kept, in the places that still bear the names of the families who built the cabins and then moved on. The cabin is gone, but the cabin still stands. In 1876, at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, a replica log cabin was erected on the fairgrounds. It was not a real cabin. It was a reproduction built by the state of Kentucky. The cabin was meant to represent the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had been born in a log cabin in 1/8 Saranine. By 1876, that cabin had already become a symbol. The replica was made of freshly cut logs, neatly notched, with a clean whitewashed interior. Visitors walked through it and marveled at the simplicity. They did not know that the real Lincoln cabin had long since disappeared. The site in Kentucky had been marked by a stone monument, but the cabin itself was gone. The replica was a fiction, but it was a useful fiction. The Centennial Exhibition drew millions of visitors. The log cabin became one of the most photographed exhibits. Newspapers wrote about it. Tourists sent postcards. The idea of the log cabin as the birthplace of the common man was cemented. Lincoln himself had used the log cabin narrative in his 1860 presidential campaign. He ran as the rail splitter, the man who had split logs and built cabins with his own hands. The campaign literature emphasized his humble origins. The message was clear. A man born in a log cabin could rise to the highest office. The cabin was proof of the American promise. But Lincoln's real childhood cabin was not a symbol. It was a cramped, dark, cold structure in the Kentucky wilderness. The Lincoln family moved several times. They lived in cabins in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois. Lincoln's mother died of milk sickness when he was 9. The family buried her near the cabin. The cabin was not a setting for a charming story. It was a place of loss, hard work, and uncertainty. Lincoln rarely spoke about his cabin years with nostalgia. He described them as the very meanest kind of living. Still, the myth grew. By the 1890s, log cabins were being built as tourist attractions, as summer cottages, and as symbols of authenticity. The Adirondack region in New York saw a surge of log cabin retreats for wealthy families. These were not frontier cabins. They were vacation homes with stone fireplaces, screened porches, and indoor plumbing. They borrowed the shape of the log cabin but discarded its harsh reality. The logs were debarked, stained, and sealed. The roofs were shingled and waterproof. The cabins were comfortable. They were romantic. Meanwhile, the actual log cabins of the frontier continued to decay. In Minnesota, a cabin built in 1854 by a Swedish immigrant named Nils Johnson stood on his homestead until 1910. Johnson had died in 1888. His children moved to town. The cabin was left empty. The roof collapsed in a heavy snow in 1905. The walls fell over the next few years. By 1930, only a pile of rotting logs and a stone chimney remained. The site was plowed under in 1940. No marker was placed. In Wisconsin, a cabin built by a German family in 1848 survived longer. It was used as a granary until 1912. Then it was abandoned. In 1937, a local historical society moved the cabin to a county park. They restored it, but they made changes. They added a new roof. They replaced the earth floor with concrete. They installed electric lights. The historical society meant well, but the restored cabin was not the cabin the family had lived in. It was a sanitized version. The smoke stains were cleaned. The log notches were repaired. The cabin looked new. It looked like the kind of cabin that appeared in paintings, not the kind that caused pneumonia. What happened to the memory of the real cabins? It was overwritten. The cabins themselves were replaced by the idea of the cabin. The idea was stronger than the reality. The idea could be shaped to fit any narrative. In the early 20th century, the log cabin became a symbol of rugged individualism. In the 1920s, the Boy Scouts built log cabins at their summer camps. In the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps built log cabin lodges in national parks. These were public buildings, not private homes. They were designed to last. They were built with preservation in mind. They were not shelters. They were monuments. By the 1940s, the log cabin was firmly established as an American archetype. It appeared in movies, in books, in advertising. It was used to sell cigarettes, coffee, and cars. The cabin was always shown as warm, clean, and welcoming. The family inside was always happy. The The fire was always bright. The wood was always dry. There was no smoke in the eyes. There was no dirt on the floor. There was no infant mortality. There was no isolation. The cabin was a stage set. Real log cabins were still being built in remote areas, but they were rare. In Alaska, homesteaders built log cabins well into the 1950s. A man named Jack Wilson built a cabin near Fairbanks in 1947. He used hand tools. He cut the logs from the surrounding forest. He notched them with an axe. He daubed the gaps with mud and moss. The cabin was 12 feet by 14 feet. It had one room, one door, one window. Wilson lived in it for 30 years. He later told a reporter that the cabin had been cold in winter, hot in summer, and full of mosquitoes in between. He did not romanticize it. He said he built it because he had no money and no choice. When he finally moved into a prefabricated house in 1979, he burned the cabin for firewood. The Wilson cabin is not a monument, it is ash. But thousands of other cabins met the same fate. They were burned, torn down, or left to rot. The logs returned to the soil. The chimneys crumbled. The cellar holes filled with leaves. The stone foundations were covered by grass. The only evidence of the cabin's existence was a slight depression in the ground and an occasional piece of pottery or a rusted nail. In the 1970s, archaeologists began excavating log cabin sites. They found that the cabins were often smaller than the historical accounts suggested. The average cabin was about 14 feet by 16 feet. The floors were packed earth. The chimneys were fieldstone held together with clay. The roofs were split shingles held in place by weight, not nails. The cabins were built to be replaced. They were not built to last. The archaeologists also found evidence of the family's lives. They found fragments of children's toys, broken dishes, buttons, coins, tools. They found the remains of iron stoves that had been installed after the initial cabin was built. They found evidence of remodels, additions, and repairs. The cabins were not static. They changed over time as the family's circumstances changed. A family that survived the first winter might add a second room the following year. They might replace the dirt floor with wood planks. They might install a glass window. They might build a proper chimney. The cabin evolved. It was a process, not a product. What explains the persistence of the log cabin myth? Part of it is the power of origin stories. Every nation needs a story about how it began. The United States began with a revolution, but it also began with a settlement. The settlement was messy, violent, and uncertain. The log cabin myth smoothed over the mess. It gave the nation a clean origin. It said that the beginning was simple, honest, and hardworking. It said that the people who built the cabins were the same people who built the nation. The myth erased the complexity. It erased the Native Americans who were displaced. It erased the enslaved people who built many of the cabins in the South. It erased the failures. It erased the suffering. But the myth also served a purpose. It gave meaning to the hardship. It allowed the descendants of the settlers to look back with pride, not shame. It allowed the nation to claim that its foundations were democratic and egalitarian. The log cabin was the house of the common man. And the common man, the myth said, was the true American. By the late 20th century, the log cabin had become a cliché. It appeared on calendars, on coffee mugs, on greeting cards. It was a symbol of rustic simplicity, of escape from modern life. Real log cabins were still being built, but they were often luxury homes. They had cathedral ceilings, granite countertops, and hot tubs. They were not shelters. They were statements. The original log cabins are almost all gone. A few survive as museum pieces. The oldest surviving log cabin in the United States is the C.A. Nothnagel log cabin in New Jersey, built around 1638 by Finnish settlers. It is still standing. It is a tourist attraction. Visitors walk through it and try to imagine what life was like. But imagination is not the same as experience. The cabin is preserved, but it is also frozen. It no longer functions as a home. It is a relic. The log cabin years are a chapter in American history that has been closed. But the chapter is still read. It is still taught in schools. It is still referenced in political speeches. Candidates still talk about their humble beginnings, sometimes using the phrase log cabin even if they never lived in one. The phrase carries weight. What remains of the log cabin today is not wood or stone. It is an idea. The idea is that hardship is temporary. That struggle leads to success. That the most difficult moment is also the most important. That the cabin was the beginning and the beginning was good. The truth is that the cabin was not good. It was necessary. It was a tool. It was a box that kept the elements out and the family in. It was a place to sleep, to eat, to give birth, to die. It was not a symbol, it was a fact, but facts are not always remembered. Symbols are. The cabin is remembered, the cabin is painted, the cabin is printed, the cabin is built again and again in miniature, in souvenir shops, in backyard play sets. The cabin is a story that America tells itself, and the story is not entirely false. There was courage in the cabins, there was strength, there was love, there was laughter, there was hope. The cabins held all of that too. The cabins held the good and the bad together like a family pressed into a single room trying to survive. The log cabin years are over. The cabins have fallen, the families have scattered, the forests have grown back or been cleared again. The land has changed hands a dozen times, but the ground remembers, and the story continues. The story is not finished. It never will be finished, because every generation asks the same questions. Where did we come from? What did they endure? How did they build a home from nothing? The answers are in the cabins that no longer stand. And so the podcast ends here, not with a conclusion, but with a silence. The silence of a forest where a cabin once stood. The silence of a field where a chimney once rose. The silence of a diary where a mother wrote her child's final days. That silence is the truest monument to the log cabin years.